So welcome tonight. I wanted to give a little bit of context on the evening. Ed called me a couple months ago and said, let's do something on the Canada-US relationship. And I said, I don't think it's possible anymore to talk about the Canada-US relationship without talking about Canada, the US, and China. And it was just a thrill when he told me that Professor Allison was able to join us. On this part of the evening, we're going to talk about what all this means for Canada, and we have several extraordinary panelists that I'm going to invite to the stage to join us. So on this question of the strategic rivalry, how should Canada play it, I think we could do a lot worse than hear from our distinguished panel. So I'd like to invite back to the stage Professor Graham Allison, who's already agreed to join us for part 2. As well as Pascale Massot, who is an assistant professor in political studies at the University of Ottawa and a specialist in Canada-China relations. And from 2015, I'll just, I've been told you're sitting right over there. From 2015 to 2017, Pascale was a policy advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs as well as the Minister of International Trade. She's also conducted field research on the ground in China, both as a visiting scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing and a visiting PhD candidate at Peking University's Center for International Political Economy. And also to round out our panel, I'd like to invite Senator Peter Harder, who's an independent senator who spent 30 years in the federal public service. And I know tonight we are celebrating the federal public service and its many contributions. And I have to say, as someone here from Washington, it's a great thing to be surrounded by the deep state. So welcome. I mean, Senator Harder's biography is incredibly long, but the Cliff's Notes are that he was Deputy Prime Minister in the Mulroney government, served as Deputy Minister under 5 Prime Ministers in the Departments of Immigration, Public Safety, Industry, and Treasury Board, and Foreign Affairs. And he has also served as President of the Canada-China Business Council. So welcome to you all. We're excited to have you here.
Nobody told me.
So they're already debating. So before we launch into Canada, I just wanted to share a few observations from where I sit in Washington to help frame this conversation. I think there are a few things that are important about the US-China conversation right now. One is that it is the absolute biggest preoccupation for Washington right now in the Trump administration and beyond. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I host a podcast called Global Translations, where we've looked at the rise of China, the response of America, and what it means for everyone else across trade, across technology, and across climate change. And I've interviewed a number of people, including Michael Pillsbury, who is an advisor to Trump on China. And as I believe Professor Allison mentioned earlier, he wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. And I think that sums up a lot of what you need to know about how Washington views the stakes. And I think we see Trump talking about trade deficits a lot, but I don't think that's really what's driving the trade war. What's really driving the trade war is, as was mentioned a little bit earlier, anxiety over technological supremacy. The US wants to end unfair trade practices such as IP theft, forced technology transfer, and basically any unfair attempts that would allow China to leapfrog the US in technology. The US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, who's emerged as the most influential person on this topic in the Trump administration, has called this the #1 most important thing he's doing in the trade war. And he said this is the thing that is going to determine the kinds of jobs that our children have. And as Ed noted earlier, there is now a view in Washington that that all these emerging technologies are basically dual use, that they have civilian and military implications that are really important, everything from AI to quantum computing to 5G. And so on the military side, I think it's important to look at the defense strategy that came out in 2018, signed by then Defense Secretary James Mattis, in which he wrote that China is seeking, quote, regional hegemony in the near term and displacement of the United States to achieve global preeminence in the future. So that is the frame through which the Trump administration is looking at China right now. But then the second thing I wanted to highlight before we get into our discussion is the remarkable level of bipartisanship around the perceived security and economic threat posed by China. So House Leader Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, are two of the biggest China hawks in Washington. In testimony to Congress, Lighthizer has talked about how far-sighted Nancy Pelosi has been on China. And Trump has called Chuck Schumer, who's the Democratic minority leader in the Senate, quote, high-tax Schumer. He's called him fake tears Chuck. But recently, Schumer tweeted, quote, hang tough on China, President real Donald Trump. Don't back down. Strength is the only way to win on China. And I was sharing with Ed the story of how when I first came to Washington 16 years ago and was covering the New York congressional delegation, including Chuck Schumer, basically every other day he was putting out a press release or a new piece of legislation about Chinese currency manipulation. So this is something he has cared about for a very long time. So what does this all mean for Canada? I'm very excited to be here with this group. And I just want to add that I have my copy of the Peloponnesian War, which dates back to 1992 when I took a course with Professor Allison's colleague, Joe Nye. And my classmates in that course were then student Caroline Mulrooney, as well as Charlotte Gray, the Canadian author. So we had quite the Canadian contingent in fall semester of 1992. So let's start with the big picture. Are we in a Cold War with China? Is this similar to the Cold War where growing up in Alberta at the time, I remember having social studies worksheets that drew the nuclear sandwich with Canada, the bologna, in the middle between America and the Soviet Union. Is that where we are? Is that how you all perceive the situation? I'll start with Professor Allison and perhaps give everyone a chance to weigh in on how you perceive this big picture of this moment that we're in.
So the answer, or we in a new Cold War, I would answer decisively yes and no. Okay?
All right, moving on.
So basically, we're confused. If you were to, and your characterization of Washington is exactly right, and the very important message you said was, this is not the Trump administration. This is swept the whole political class. So Democrats are now positioning themselves to the right of Trump. Democrats running against Trump for president are positioning themselves to the right of Trump on China. So go figure, okay? So this has happened very rapidly. And across most of the think tanks, there's almost agreement. So that's the picture. Now then, in that confusion, people asking for an analogy, think of the Cold War, because they can at least remember vaguely that there was a Cold War, and they remember we won, so that sounds good. If you read as I mentioned before, the best short overview of what the administration's policy on China is the Pence speech at the Hudson Institute, and it basically is backing in to Cold War 2.0. So sometimes within the government, people talk about Cold War 2.0. I think, interestingly, what that fails to appreciate is how radically different the world is in 2019 than in 1950 when we developed the Cold War strategy. So basically, the Soviet Union was an autarkic economy that had marginalized itself. Didn't amount to, 5 or 6% of the world's GDP, and it didn't trade with anybody except the captive nations that were part of its empire. China is a backbone of the global economy, has a GDP larger than the US in purchasing power parity, and is the biggest trading partner of everybody. So a Cold War is not going to include, as I said before, decoupling China. So now it's just become more complicated. So I think there's some similarities. The most important similarity that's a good similarity is the good thing about Cold War is that it's not hot. So Cold War was the alternative to thousands of uniform combatants killing each other. That was what was cold. Every other dimension was competitive or even rivalrous, even adversarial. And I would say that's, for many of the dimensions, we're moving into a not hot, and I hope not to become hot, adversarial relationship. But in the trade space, in the Cold War, there were always the so-called non-aligned. If you were sticking with that analogy, in the economic arena, most of the world will be, quote, non-aligned. That is, it'll have complex relationships with each of the adversaries.
Well, in the Cold War, we had these spheres of influence, and most countries positioned themselves on one side or the other, voluntarily or not so voluntarily. I was born in Poland.
Including Poland, yeah.
So, Senator Harder, is this a situation, do you perceive it as something where Canada has to choose, or is there an option of being non-aligned? How does that look to you?
Well, that's a very good question. My own take on this is those who would wish to describe it as a Cold War are doing so without a strategic sense of how a Cold War ought to be engaged. Where's the George Kennan of this theory? We're missing that.
None.
That's one. The second is the premise of Kennan and all of the American presidents since, in respect of the Cold War, was multilateralism was the key to containment. My fear is that the multilateral enthusiasm is zero in Washington, and there might be a political consensus in Washington on China, but it's a consensus that others won't buy into the way the Cold War was managed. And I think that's one of the major challenges of our time.
Professor Massot?
Thank you. If I can continue a little bit on this. It doesn't need to be. If we think a Cold War, if we think that it is, we're more likely to enter into dynamics that will lead to conflict, right? And that's a key part of Professor Allison's book. One of the most important chapters of the book, of course, is the 12 Clues for Peace. And if you allow me to mention just a couple, or a few rather, with, in one word, the implications for today. The first clue for peace, right, is higher authority. So in this chapter, Professor Allison tries to give us some clues that would reduce the likelihood of conflict, right? So higher authority, multilateralism. If there are, invest in multilateralism. Economic interdependence is one. What does that mean for the US? What would that mean for Canada? We would prefer no decoupling. Don't decouple. That increases the likelihood of conflict. Nuclear, mutually assured destruction is not a good thing. Rules of engagement. Important for areas of fundamental disagreements with China. Cultural alignment is something that Dr. Allison mentions as something that would reduce the likelihood for conflict. It's relevant in the US, UK-US transition. What does that mean for the US? What would Canada want the US to do? What would it mean for us? Invest in people-to-people flow. Invest in cultural understanding. Invest in understanding of China. And then one of the very important, very interesting clues for peace, the last one, I believe, is domestic strength. So invest domestically. Invest in the systems, the institutions, the industries that you care about instead of trying to undermine China's industries, invest home.
But I'd like to hone in on the first thing you said, which is have bigger picture rules, have a rules-based order, if I understand that. What I hear repeatedly in Washington is, hey, we tried that. It was called the WTO, and we let China in on this theory that, oh, it's the end of history, the march of democracy, and there's this great quote from Bill Clinton where he talks about how, this is, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but basically this is the first step to China changing, and through more engagement and constructive engagement, they'll become more democratic and more capitalist and so on. And what we hear in Washington now is like, that all failed, and instead we had a China that is not only authoritarian, but has taken advantage of us, America, has flouted the rules, has forced companies to hand over their IP, has flooded the market with cheap subsidized goods, has dumped their steel, has put our people out of work. We want to, change things. So how do we create a rules-based order when the biggest player on the block doesn't want to play by the rules and yet is so economically integrated that the costs of taking actions against that country, as we've all seen, boomerang back on everybody else because of these deep integrations?
Yeah, so I have thought about this question a lot. One of Professor Allison's colleagues, actually, Dr. Ian Johnston, has published a great piece in the Washington Quarterly this summer, The Failure of Engagement. And in it, he questions the premise that opening up to China and China opening up to the world was a failure. It doesn't mean that the situation is perfect. It doesn't mean that we can't push for important changes in the way that China interfaces with the global economy. But to presume that that we have failed, the world has failed, and China has failed to commit to international rules, make China commit, and China is not committing to international rules, that opening up has not led to China liberalizing economically and politically, and that the alternative, that's his third argument, would have been better. In other words, not opening up. China not opening up to the world would have made America better. All three of these premises, I think, are incorrect. So China is not undermining every part of the international system. It has mixed behaviors across a range of global issues, sometimes more productive and constructive, sometimes a little bit less. Domestically, I think we underestimate how much China has changed as a result to interaction with the world and how globalized it has become. Of course, we have fundamental divergences in socio-political values, but nevertheless. And I think that the last point that he makes in this article, which is very important, is that the alternative might have been much worse. In other words, that a China that would be, if we push the argument, undermined economically, not prosperous, not open to the world, would have been a much less appealing scenario for the world than the China that we have today, as imperfect as we think the situation is.
So let me agree and disagree. So I think Lighthizer has a good analogy, which you may have heard from him. He says, China's entry into the WTO 2001, it was like we thought that they had given us this small cub tiger that was a pet for a house. We fed it, it played with the children, it was very polite. And then we went away from the country house and now we came back. And there's this huge tiger. We didn't imagine this was going to grow up to be an economy bigger than ours. So if you look at what actually has happened, it is stunning. Never before has a country risen so far, so fast on so many different dimensions. And China has come from nowhere to everywhere in all the elite charts. So that's a big, big shock. So that's point one. Point two, what you said rightly. So part of what this is a great improvement in human well-being. I mean, the most impressive story about China for me is what's happened to abject poverty. Yeah. 90% of all the people in China lived on less than $2 a day in 1978 when the opening began. Today, that's 1%. And by the end of 2020, it's going to be 0%. So never this happened before. 800 million people who used to be miserably poor have a little bit more to eat and a little bit more dignity in their life. I mean, what human being can't be thrilled by that, to be alive when all this has happened? So that's fantastic. But at the same time, here's a China with a GDP as big as the US. The US is not accustomed to having anybody as big and strong as the US. So it seems threatening. And if Chinese turn out to be only half as productive as Americans, and they're pretty smart, they're pretty hardworking, then they'll have twice the GDP of the US. I mean, arithmetic doesn't lie. So could Could the U.S. live with a country that has twice the GDP, maybe has twice the defense budget? Maybe, so you go down that line. So that's part of the sort of shaking and shock in the DC setting now that's finding its way through the whole political class.
Can I just intervene on this and make a couple of points? The first is, the great conceit of our time has been the belief that China would become like us. Whoever said that, you quoted President Clinton, others have said it. I think that they have not studied China historically or understood the objectives of either Deng Xiaoping or certainly Xi now. I would argue that Xi is a game changer in a particular fashion, but the conceit is what is driving, I think, a lot of the policy and mindset in our friends to the south, and that needs to be corrected. The second is, just as we did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, sought ways to better manage difference, we have to find ways of better managing difference, including finding where we cooperate and where we will have different objectives and managing them in a fashion where we avoid the absolute worst scenario, which in my view is nuclear war and conflict of some sort that is unpredictable. And in a certain way, I think we become inured to the likelihood or even the opportunity of that happening. And that discipline has lost our sense of proportionality of rhetoric and of policy choice.
I wonder, Senator, from your perch, one difference that strikes me between the present day and the Cold War is America's relationships with its allies, right? The Cold War was a time of really building up NATO, building the transatlantic and Western democratic alliances. And right now we're in an era of America first. And to be an ally of America feels a lot more precarious than it did. How is that influencing the conversation here in Ottawa about how to consider requests from America, whether it's to not include Huawei in 5G networks, whether it is to include non-market economy clause in trade agreements, which they want to put across the board in their bilateral trade agreements? How is that coloring Canada's approach to China?
It obviously adds another layer of complexity, but I'd make a couple of points. One is, it is with deep regret that Canada views the lack of the American participation in the CPTPP, because that was a mechanism of multilateral concerted action, particularly in Asia, that would have advanced, I believe, our collective interests with respect to how Asia evolves and a high level of rule of law, economic discourse. So that is an example of where I believe the United States has missed the opportunity, and that is to be regretted. The second aspect of this is a country like Canada has always placed value and priority in rule of law and providing greater clarity in our economic and security interactions. And the unpredictability, let alone the go-it-aloneness of American foreign policy is deeply disturbing.
So if I can come in on 2 points there, and agreeing, I think they're both big points. So first, the departure from the alliance system is unique to Trump. So that's not swept the whole American political class. If there's a Democrat in office in January 2021, I think you'll get a quick return to international agreements on climate, and I think you'll get an effort to try to reconstruct what can be of some part of the alliance system, even though with a lot of damage and with a lot of questions. And actually, the alliance system needed very substantial rehab anyhow. It's been kind of on autopilot, but the hostility to it that Trump feels that we've been ripped off by all of these agreements is not part of the political discussion for most Democrats. So that's on that side. I think on the other point, I'm basically a realist, and actually Thucydides was not only the founder of history, he was the founder of realpolitik. So basically, as a first approximation, nations behave as badly as they can, unfortunately, but I would say that's. So now the question is, can one construct in frameworks in which it is in their interest not to behave badly? That's what a good legal structure does. Human beings would probably kill many more human beings if they weren't captured and punished for it. So fortunately they are. So in the international context, and especially for middle powers, they are especially interested in this because their capacity for bad behavior is not as great as that of the strong. So in Thucydides' famous Melian dialogue, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must.
Well, so I think that's a perfect analogy.
But the constraints like the TPP system, which give me more benefits than costs as long as I behave appropriately, if you have appropriate enforcement, that's the art in it, if it can happen. I'm sorry.
No, I wanted to you said the weak suffer what they must, and I think that's a perfect segue to Canada and Huawei. So here
I thought it was NAFTA.
Or NAFTA, great. But here we are. I want to really drill in on Huawei because I think everyone in this room would love to hear you address this. But I wanted to start with Pascale because here we are, rule of law. The US asks for Canada to arrest this Huawei executive, and Canada does so in accordance with treaties and whatever. And suddenly, not rule of law, 2 Canadians are arrested and held as basically hostages in China. How should, and Canada's being asked to exclude, as are many other countries, Huawei from their 5G networks on the theory that it can be used for surveillance. Canada wants to belong to Five Eyes. This is a complicated decision. So, Professor Massot, what should Canada do on Huawei? Both how should we get these Canadians back, and should we allow Huawei in our 5G networks? How do you analyze that situation?
Very simple question.
Good.
So I would say a few things. First, in this moment in time, where we are now, which is 11 months after the arrest of Mrs. Meng and the 2 Canadians, but a couple months before a very important judicial step in the Canadian system that will happen in January, I think that the 2 extreme positions, which are played in the media in various forms, which would be, cave in immediately to Chinese demands, or escalate robustly in response to Chinese, measures, are both going to lead to unfortunate outcomes for Canada and for the 2 Canadians at play in jail right now. It's less. It makes perhaps for less good news, but I think a kind of keep calm and navigate right now is some of what the current government has been doing. And probably in the context of the Meng affair, the middle ground is the best. But you ask about Huawei more generally. It's difficult to tackle these questions in a couple minutes. But Huawei more generally, what I would say is that the Huawei decision should not be one decision. Huawei is a multiplicity of decisions. Huawei is Huawei investment in Canadian universities. It's Huawei hardware in more core areas, and Huawei, software and hardware in less core areas. It's handsets. It's consumer protection and data. So there's all sorts of a variety of decisions to be made, and these should be approached as far as things can be separately and with the aim to draw rules of engagement that go way beyond China, but address those questions as policy questions with Canadian interests at the center. And as we do that, of course, one of the major stakeholders in this is the United States. And we have some very tough homework to do in trying to identify very accurately, precisely, where US interests lie in each of these areas, And as Professor Allison points out in his book, sometimes it seems like the US doesn't really know exactly what it wants to do in each and every of these areas. So it's a challenge for Canada, but we need to do this.
Well, Senator Harder, should Canada allow Huawei and its 5G networks, and should it release the Huawei executive, Madam Meng?
Well, let me answer it in the following fashion. I actually agree with Pascale's analysis on both issues, and I would add a couple of points. One is Pew Research published a poll last week of global comparisons of attitudes to China. The attitudes of Canadians towards China has suffered a 22-point decline in positive views, which was the largest decline in any of the countries that were surveyed, which tells you something about the constraints from a public opinion point of view that the government must manage this file within. And I do think that the points that Pascale made are relevant here. With regard to Huawei and the way you've posed the question, I would be very Canadian in this and say that's not a binary yes-no answer. There is a process underway of actually parsing out the component parts of the question, doing an analytical analysis of what is in our security, political, and economic interest. And I am sure in that process, there will be a decision reached. But I would suggest that the decision we make in respect of 5G, or as we were discussing at my table, 6G research, ought to be one of governance, not of whether it's Huawei or not. In other words, how should Canada apply its ability to govern these decisions irrespective of whether it's Huawei or anybody else?
Well, because you're being, I'm going to ask you to respond to something here, because you're being so agreeable with each other, which is really frustrating to a journalist. But one of your colleagues at Ottawa U, Margaret McQuaig-Johnson, issued a paper today, and she said that Canada should impose Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese officials for the detention of Michael Kovrig, increase the cost or prohibit the sale of Canadian real estate for buyers from China, return China's athletes who are training for the Winter Olympics that are to be held in China in 2022, send home China's pandas 3.5 years early, refuse to plan events marking the 50th anniversary of Canada's recognition of China in 2020, and review whether to withdraw from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and introduce legislation similar to Australia's Foreign Influence Transparency Act. So should Canada be taking some of these measures and taking a harder line to help, or would it help Canadians who are being held right now by Beijing?
Well, it would certainly not help the 2 Canadians held right now by Beijing. If that was the only objective, that certainly would not reach that objective. But let me mention a few more numbers from a survey that was conducted by UBC professors Paul Evans and Xiaojun Li, who asked questions about Meng and about Huawei. And Canadians are actually fairly nuanced on the question, where half of Canadians don't think Huawei should play a major role in the 5G network. 43% of them think that Huawei should be an investor in R&D in Canada. One more number just to give you a sense of how more sophisticated I think the Canadian public is on China than we give them benefit for, is 68% of Canadians think that Canada should have or can have a good relationship with both the US and China. And 74% think that the current predicament that we're in is a result of Canada being stuck, the baloney answer, stuck between Canada, China, and the US. I personally think that as upset as we can be about the retaliatory approaches that the Chinese government has taken, that we have to remain fixated on our core interests on the long term, that we cannot be emotional, We shouldn't take policy decisions that will not be constructive for Canada and or the two Canadians in the long term. And so we can't, I don't think that sending back pandas would accomplish any foreign policy objective whatsoever. It's very important because it's tempting, right? We're upset, so it's tempting, but I don't think it's a productive way to go.
Where does, in this day and age, human rights fit into China's policy or Canada's policy towards China? Professor Allison, you talked about Kennedy's quote about making the world safe for diversity. But what about a diversity that includes 1 million Uyghurs and Kazakhs in internment camps where they are monitored by AI-enabled facial recognition and voice recognition technology under constant surveillance? And I found this quite chilling. The New York Times report you may have seen where they were leaked a cache of internal Chinese documents that detailed what officials were to say to the to the children whose parents were disappeared overnight into these detention camps. And the official answer was you were to tell them they are, quote, in training school, and how they do there will depend on your behavior, they're saying to the children. This plus watching the escalating confrontation in Hong Kong where you have young students who are fighting to have a free future. Given the pressure on Canada and this unequal relationship that we're facing, is there any room at all for human rights? How does Canada even get leverage on that issue?
Let me try to take a stab at that question. First of all, I think that the issues of human rights and social well-being, political evolution, et cetera, are best dealt with multilaterally as well as bilaterally. I'm not saying that, but the questions you pose aren't unique to Canada. What is Germany doing? What is France doing? What is Britain doing? And I do think that one of the challenges of our time, as I said earlier, was getting better at how do we manage disagreement and a fundamental disagreement with a China that is going to be bigger in our political, economic, and security interest ahead. And simply doing a list of actions which make us feel good, perhaps, don't have a strategic intent, I would suggest are not in our long-term interest. That is where Canada can perhaps have some early opportunities to convene that kind of discussion because we are very much in the matters that you've raised at the hot furnace point of this relationship.
Well, Professor Allison, I wanted to pull back the lens with you for a moment. You travel around the world, you see what other countries are doing. Are there other middle powers, so to speak, that are formulating policies towards China or this bipolar situation we're finding ourselves in that Canada should take notice of?
So, good question. I think that the rivalry between the US and China will become increasingly recognized as the principal dynamic of international politics and will cause divides around this axis. But I think for other parties, since they'll remain 2/3 of the world's GDP, if and when they get their act together, like with respect to TPP, they can have rules for anybody that wants to play in their sandpit. And they can have rules for enforcing it. So the US cannot participate in the benefits of TPP because it's not a member.
But
China can't, it's not a member.
I have to push back on this a little bit because I think we're having this kind of like happy view up here that we can just accommodate and work with China and da-da-da. But I mean, if you look at some of the criticism, for example, of what China is doing around the world with its Belt and Road program, its massive investments in infrastructure in the developing world aimed at extracting resources to use back in China, One critique you hear is, well, they are coming in with money for these countries, and they're not attaching the same requirements around transparency, around labor standards, around environmental standards, and in doing so, they are really undermining those sort of global rules that Western countries have worked to establish, and it's kind of a race to the bottom. So again, to go back to this, I guess, fundamental tension, how do you create these rules in your backyard when you have one player that is so big and so powerful and doesn't necessarily want to abide by them?
But it's for sure that the Chinese have a different set of core values, and they don't make any pretense about those. They believe that people in Hong Kong should obey their orders and should not have the freedoms that people in Hong Kong had grown up imagining living in this bubble that they had under the British. So basically, that's a conflict in values, and I think we should never be ashamed of calling it out, standing up for our values, saying what we think is wrong. But is anybody proposing to send anybody to fight for Hong Kongers? No. If something terrible happens in Hong Kong, it'll happen like Tiananmen, but nobody's going to send somebody to fight for that. One, because they don't want to bleed for it, and second, because it might escalate to a war that comes to Canada or comes to the US. So in the Cold War, there was always this sort of a tension between, on the one hand, knowing we've got to somehow constrain the competition not to get in a war, but Ronald Reagan didn't have any problem speaking out very vigorously about Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And I think to the extent that we can demonstrate in democratic societies, if we can, that they better serve the interests of their people and let people realize, I mean, that's at least been our bet. Now, in the Canadian story, I would say you all still have a pretty good version of that story. In the American story, that's getting harder. Because
here's
look
my
like we
question.
can't even govern ourselves.
Can
in
we
which
really,
case,
though?
preaching to somebody else about how to govern themselves.
But tear down that wall. Right? I'm not just trying to be contrarian here. This is a genuine question. Tear down that wall. When you have Chinese companies owning social media platforms and they are censoring those, taking down any kind of content about the Hong Kong protests, when you have Chinese companies owning Hollywood movie studios and telling them to censor a Taiwan badge on a character's jacket, when you have them dictating to airlines that it's not Taipei, Taiwan, it's just Taipei, you're not allowed to say Taiwan. I mean, do we really have that freedom of expression to say tear down that wall? It feels to me that increasingly with the economic interdependence and the economic power, that space to speak out, whether it's on the internet, in movies, or other elements of the culture, like that space is shrinking.
Well, they do a very good job with their Great Wall, trying to wall off the world. But as Lee Kuan Yew explained to them, and this is Lee Kuan Yew running Singapore, so he explained to Xi Jinping, and I described this in the book. He said, I'm telling you, your operating system, your authoritarian operating system is a 20th century operating system. We're living in the 21st century with 21st century apps. You cannot keep pasting 21st century apps onto a 20th century operating system. This is not going to work. You're going to have people that are on their smartphones, and kids now get around the Great Wall to see what's happening. They can see what's happening in the world. So they're not going to be able to be commanded the way that you would imagine you can command them. Now, I believe Lee Kuan Yew was right, but I've been watching, particularly with the arrival of big data and data analytics and AI, you may have actually technologies now that enable Orwell's, or basically watching and controlling everything in a way that was unimaginable. I mean, before it was just a dystopia as a novel. So it's conceivable that a party with so enabled can rule all of 1.4 billion people. It's conceivable. I still don't believe it. I believe in every breast is a heart beating to be free. I think that's what human beings are. So I think if we can make our system work and show that it works, then we compete in a lot of areas, but also watch very carefully not getting dragged into a war. I'm not giving up on our side yet.
Okay, well that's uplifting. And we're going to look for some questions in the audience now. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. And while we do that, I wanted to ask you, both Senator Harder and Professor Massot, we don't really have a clear China policy on the part of the government yet. What should a policy either look like, or if you don't want to be that prescriptive, what questions do you think it should answer?
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
It's safer for you.
She's just been writing that last night. So it'll be unfurled tomorrow, yes.
So I have been thinking of the best way to formulate Canada-China policy. I think that one way to say it is a modulated approach, so adaptive and strategic, but modulated.
Modulated.
And so this would mean that we would have to learn to live with a complicated China.
Kind of like IKEA furniture.
A China with which we will have areas, and Kevin Rudd in his recent speech actually frames it in a similar way. We would have to learn to live with a China with which we have fundamental areas of disagreements, a China with which we have minor areas of disagreements, and a China with which we can cooperate and collaborate on some issues. And we have to be able to deal with those multiple Chinas. We cannot put China in a yes-no box. We cannot put China in a I like everything and I dislike everything.
But to go back to Trump, so the response to Trump in Canada has been, well, we're going to have a Minister of Trade diversification, right? No longer a Minister of Trade. Do you think we should be deepening economic integration with China, or should we say, whoa, that's making our lives more complicated?
I think that in the long view, we should be deepening our economic relationships across the Asia-Pacific, including China. But with a view, a 25-year, 50-year view, definitely. I don't see a world, a better world for Canada. Canada would be decoupling from China. I don't think that that's realistic or going to be beneficial.
Can I totally agree, but I would emphasize one point that Pascale's made. And that's, I do think we need to be more confident, self-confident, about how we manage disagreement. And that there are areas where we should robustly protect our values and advance our values. Interference by China or anybody in our political process ought to be called out. That's not something, so I'm not afraid of differences. I just think we have to be more sophisticated in our management of them and cognizant of the constraints that real world politics places on a serious government.
I think there's a question over here.
Hi, again. Thanks. I have a question and an observation. I'll start with the observation. George Orwell also wrote a book called Animal Farm. And you'll recall that everyone was equal, but some are more equal than others. And I think that when we look at how public discourse has been shaped in China vis-a-vis what's been happening with the Uyghur, and let's face it, with other people, including the Tibetans, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that there are a lot of Han Chinese who are pretty well on board with what the Communist Party has been doing. And the question is this. We talked about the need for plurilateral and multilateral approaches to questions such as China's behavior in those places that I just mentioned, or for that matter, its behavior in the South China Sea, its bullying of its neighbors. Let's not forget that Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, these countries have not, and certainly not Vietnam, they have not ceded their own claims to sovereignty over rocks and reefs in the South China Sea. Does anyone up sitting there now believe that there will be a willingness on the part of elites in a number of countries that have all these big relationships on the economic side with China Does anyone really believe that we're going to see plurilateral criticism backed up with, I don't know, Magnitsky sanctions or some other mechanism to punish them? Thanks.
So, good question, and I think on the Chinese government's treatment of the Uyghurs that we talked about before. So Muslims, they've decided, are hard to distinguish from terrorists in the extreme version, and they're more concerned about them than any normal government should be. So I think they feel a fragility that generally analysis of the Chinese government doesn't emphasize enough. And I think that's actually part of their concern right now about Hong Kong. But I think that a more concerted effort internationally to call that out and to make it plain that's unacceptable behavior actually has some impact on the Chinese, because they still are seeking respect. They're not immune to views of other people. But I think, on the other hand, in many arenas, the balance of forces is such that I don't believe that China will be challenged. And I think that the immediate neighbors, especially the small, weaker immediate neighbors, will have to live with China the way folks in the Western Hemisphere have learned to live with the US. And the answer is very uncomfortably. Now, the US-Canadian relations have been pretty comfortable for recent period, but I reminded people at lunch today, in my book I have a nice discussion of when Teddy Roosevelt took a bite from China in the fat tail of Alaska. If you look, there's this thing that cuts China off from the ocean that goes down to Juneau, and that wasn't always that case. So it's an interesting story. All of the Latin Americans have been accustomed to Americans interfering in their affairs repeatedly. Indeed, Teddy Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine said, if any government in our hemisphere misbehaves, and we get to judge what is misbehaving, we'll send the Marines and change the government. And every year that followed, for the next decade, we sent the Marines somewhere and changed some government.
And longer.
And longer, but I mean, not necessarily. It then went to a little, then a year and a half, then 2 years, still for occasionally. So I think I would suspect that the best way that the neighbors are going to live is cautiously, deferentially. Nobody's going to fight China over the islands in the South China Sea. Nobody's going to contest their militarization. And countries in the region have figured that out and are trying to make their accommodation. The interesting exception right now is Vietnam, which has always had a very fierce relationship with China. But I think in the end, they won't really have any alternative but humor them. Yeah.
I want to see if there's a question on this side of the room, but I can't see. Any more questions in the audience? Okay, over here. This side of the room. Come on, guys. Raise your game.
Hi. I was wondering, so a strategy implies we have a long-term goal, and a lot of our strategy is just managing a relationship. Is there a time or some consideration that we have that allows us to get ahead of the game and to position ourselves so that we're not always in responsive mode? Thanks.
Well, by definition,
Yeah, rephrase the question for me. I didn't get it. Can you summarize the question?
I think she was looking for a long-term goal in this relationship, and how do we move from being reactive and trying to manage day by day to having some kind of a longer-term vision, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Thank you.
but surely our long-term goal is to avoid a very disruptive war, and that ought to be, we ought to remind ourselves that that's a laudable goal. We've sort of, as I said earlier, discounted the fact that that's a possibility. It is a real possibility. So that's one. Two, advancing the security, political, and economic interests of Canada. That's Canada's goal. And I'm sure other countries have goals that are similarly advancing of theirs. In the Canadian context, the way of achieving those goals are often plurilateral by the very definition of who we are and where we are geographically. And I do think the very nature of this dynamic will always make us evolving in the puts and takes of what that means at the time, because we are not the masters of defining all of those relationships.
I wanted to ask Professor Massot on that point. You were involved in advising the Trudeau government earlier on ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to China. Can you talk a little bit about what were the goals of that trip? And since we are on the eve of a new cabinet and a new government, what are the goals going to be going forward?
Well, I can't speak. I'm a full-time academic right now, so I can't speak to the goals going forward too much, but I can give my advice as to what I think those goals should be, which is different. But at the time, so in the early months, the first year and a bit of the Trudeau government, there was a profound, very serious effort to rethink the China relationship. And one of the things that I think has been underestimated, perhaps outside of government, that was done was establish a structure. So give the relationship a structure. So a number of the objectives that were realized in that trip were the establishment of official dialogues at the foreign minister level, at the finance and trade minister level, national security and rule of law dialogue. And one of the saddest parts of the kind of deep freeze that we are in right now is that some of these dialogues, including the national security and rule of law dialogue, would be very useful exactly right now
For these issues.
Exactly for the kind of issues the times that we are in, and the dialogue is still being frozen. And so I hope one of the things that the current ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, can achieve is the reopening of official channels of communication that are very necessary right now.
Could I add one thought? Again, this is always a foreigner should be careful about offering counsel to another country about China's goals with respect to, or Canada's goals with respect to China. But I'd go back to the point I had made before, which is not meant to be flattering. I just meant to be analytic. I think the demonstration that a society as diverse as Canada can govern itself is a huge idea. We've forgotten, again, in the same way we've forgotten that war is not obsolete. The whole idea of human beings in a society governing themselves, Americans' founding fathers, if you had asked John Adams, as he said, we're leaving you a republic. The question is, can you keep it? And I'm betting you will not be able to. So normally, a system like that should fail. A democratic governance that works for a society is a fantastic thing. Now, we're in the midst of a real problem in America now, whether that form of government can long endure. And fortunately, we've nearly fallen in this hole a couple of times before. We actually had a big civil war about that. So things can turn out pretty bloody, but so far, so good. Mm-hmm. But not guaranteed. Britain, which was the model previously, I think has demonstrated currently that they cannot govern themselves. They're not governing themselves. So I think there's something to be said for making making Canada work as a demonstration, and then other folks can learn from it. So among your other objectives, I wouldn't give that one up. I would say that's a big deal. Yeah.
And that's an uplifting thought. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to very quickly touch on one other uplifting thought, since I already mentioned all the downers. And that is on climate. I think you mentioned all the dialogues that were frozen, but on climate, I had a conversation with Minister Catherine McKenna about how Canada and China kept the climate dialogue going even after Washington pulled out or announced it was going to be pulled out of Paris. And it's quite striking to me also that California has done the same. So while Washington and Beijing are in this deep freeze, the governor of California has reached accords with China, with Canada as well. So and I won't get into details, but it's quite amazing what China's been doing on climate just in the last 5 years in terms of electrification and all the steps they're taking kind of ahead of where they thought they would be. And that's according to American NGOs who work there and are kind of amazed at what they're seeing on the ground. So is there room, do you think, to build on that particular piece of shared interest, as you were mentioning in the last session, to maybe use that as sort of
That was
a
one
foundation?
that was one of the sectors that was identified by political leaders over the last two governments of intensification of cooperation, because it's in all of our interests, both environmentally and economically. And I do think there are opportunities to do that. The Canadian relationship with China on the environment generally has been 30, 40 years and has sustained ups and downs. But this is one sector that I do think we can have a win that can be recognized by both.
The other big fact is, if you take the younger population, in all the polls, climate is just like huge as an issue. So I don't have any doubt that the next administration, whenever it comes, in 2021 or thereafter, you'll see a big pivot back to a recognition that we have a very small biosphere, that either we or China can spoil it all by ourselves, that if we don't find some way to work at it jointly, and Canada can have already been arranging the pieces of that, because it's not only the US and China, they just happen to be the two biggest greenhouse gas emitters.
Yeah. I mean, on building the pieces, if I may add just a quick thought, one thing that Canada can do, that it can do better than the US right now, is to set the stage for when and if the two big powers are going to be ready to come to the table. And we've been doing some of this with the WTO, for example, by setting up, starting discussions about WTO reforms that did not include the US or China. But for a not too long ahead future, when an American administration might be ready to come back to the table and think multilaterally, Canada can prepare the ground for that.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've all learned there's a big role for Canada to play in this moment in history. So I hope this is just the beginning of a lot more conversation on this topic. And in the meantime, everyone's going to go and read their Thucydides. So thank you so much for a wonderful evening. And thank you to all of you for helping us unravel some of these questions.